Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining us today for the Central Region Climate Outlook. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Jim Angel. He is the state climatologist with the Illinois State Water Survey, University of Illinois. And without further ado, Jim, happy spring equinox to you.
Thank you, John. Well, that's right. That's just, I guess, a happy coincidence that we picked this day when it's the spring equinox. And, of course, this is not the beginning of spring. It's the astronomical spring, so it doesn't always match up with what we experience outside. So we're going to talk today about what's happening and what is it forecasted to happen across the central region. And first, a couple of housekeeping things. As far as general information, this is part of a concerted effort. We've got folks like Dennis Toddy at South Dakota, and myself, and Doug Cluck and John Ice at NOAA at Central Region Headquarters, and a whole host of state climatologists and regional climate centers across the Central Region. Our next Climate Drought Outlook webinar will be April 17th, which is on a Thursday. And there's also going to be a special call just for the Missouri River Basin on April 4th as well. There's some issues up there, and we'll touch on those a little bit today, but we won't spend too much time on that. You can access all of our past webinars, and these will also be posted as well. This one, at both the High Plains and Midwestern Regional Climate Center, and there's the URLs there. And we will have time in the end for some questions as well. So hopefully you have some lined up for us for our panel of experts here. So the agenda is we're going to look at the historical context of what's happening and current conditions and what are the impacts and what are the outlooks. I was hiking this weekend in central Illinois, and in a nearby lake here, they had put out some pine trees, the Christmas trees from Christmas. They lay out on the lake. Then when the lake thaws out in the spring, they sink to the bottom there and become habitat for the fish. What's unusual about that is this picture was taken in mid-March. Normally, we don't have that much ice on the lakes, and usually by mid to late January or early February, it's pretty much gone. So it's very unusual to see ice on a lake in central Illinois at this time of year, and I'm sure that's true across a lot of parts of the central part of the central region, that we've got a lot of cold-like conditions still out there. So, I was trying to come up with a theme song for this webinar, and I did come across this one from Ella Fitzgerald. Spring will be a little late this year, and a rather melancholy song about the spring being late, and so that's kind of our theme song for this particular seminar. So there's a YouTube link to it if you want to listen to it. But back to the story here. If we look at the 30-day temperatures, boy, you could show this map probably over and over again for the last 3 or 4 months. We've actually had below average temperatures for much of the Midwest and the central region since pretty much since November. And the heart of the really cold air has been over the Great Lakes region. So that's where we've been seeing the largest departures. We've seen it all winter, and now even in the last 30 days, we have departures that are on the order of 6 to 9 to 12 degrees below average for that particular part of the region. So the upper Midwest, kind of the Great Lakes region, very cold by the historical standards. Now you get into the southern part of the central region and you go farther west, it's not quite as bitterly cold. There we see departures are more on the order of about 3 to 6 degrees below average. And you get into the far western part there, you get into Colorado and Wyoming, they're actually on the warm side. So a big contrast, not only north to south, but east to west in terms of the temperature departure gradient there. So still kind of the same story we've been seeing for quite some time now. This is the 30-day precipitation departures, and the areas shaded in yellows are some degree below average. And at first this looks a little bit alarming to see 30-day map like this with all these yellows and oranges and reds in them. But in reality, for the most part, the departures are fairly mild. If you look at many parts of the High Plains and the upper Midwest there, most of those departures are just slightly below average for the last 30 days. The only time you really get into really significant departures are in parts of Kansas and Missouri, southern Illinois, and southern Indiana. So there is kind of a stretch of exceptionally dry conditions across the southern part of the central region. But for the rest of the central region, it's pretty close to the long-term average for the last 30 days. And in fact, it's actually been on the wet side up in the northwest part of the region there. So that's the 30-day precipitation accumulations as a percent of normal. If you look at the 90 days, it looks a little more intense there. You see that area that was kind of dry in Kansas and Missouri is getting the colors are getting a little warmer there, a lot more reds. You're seeing departures there. They're running now from 3 to 5 inches below average in that region. So really kind of intensified, actually drought-like conditions in that particular area. There's some other areas that are starting to get a little on the dry side, 1 to 2 inch departures below average in parts of Nebraska and Kansas there, and spilling on into Iowa and parts of South Dakota. If this was the middle of summer, that would certainly be alarming, but this time of year, some of those areas don't get a lot of precipitation anyway. While it's nice to have it in the wintertime, it's not critical for the growing season in particular, or not as critical. And the other thing is that this time of year, the ET rates are very low, except in the far southern part of the region. So even if you're short a little bit, you really don't see any impacts of that. But I would say I would still be concerned about what we're seeing in parts of Kansas and Missouri there, and kind of starting to spill over into parts of Illinois and Iowa as well. Go farther west, it looks pretty wet out in Colorado and Wyoming and Montana. Many of those areas are above average on precipitation. And if you go to the far east, all the way over to Indiana and Ohio and parts of Michigan, that area has also been very wet in the last 90 days as well. Those are the two areas that are above average on precipitation. So kind of some overall dryness in the central part of the central region, and then some wetness on the edges there. So we'll have to watch that as we move forward. This is the 30-day snowfall since our last briefing. And what we've got here is this is in inches across the whole central region. The areas in some shade of green are running about 4 to 10 inches of snowfall, and then the areas in blue are 15 to 20 to 25 inches. So you can see there's some couple of spots that did get some pretty good snows in the last 30 days, because parts of the upper Midwest are fairly snowy, and then also parts out west there are pretty snowy as well. And probably the most significant snowfall totals are out there out in the Rockies in Montana and Wyoming, and as well as Colorado there, where they got 20 to 25, 30 inches or more out there. And this is a gridded product, so it kind of mashes out some of those higher totals. So some of the individual totals out west may even be higher than what we're seeing here. This just kind of gives you an overall picture. In general, across the Midwest, many of these areas, it's not unusual to get snow this time of year, so they're a little bit above average on snowfall for this 30-day period, but it's not exceptional except for that area in the far west there. So that's where we stand on snowfall. After a very snowy winter, it's still kind of continuing onward in the last 30 days, and so we have many places that have pretty significant wintertime snowfall totals, and I'm not as familiar with the western part of the region, but we've got in the eastern part some pretty sizable snowfall totals, not necessarily record-setting, but certainly in the top 10. And we step back and look at snow depth. This is from today, and see what's actually out there on the ground right at the moment. And there's still a little bit of snow cover up in Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan. It's pretty typical for this time of year for those guys to still have lingering snowfall. The amounts aren't that sizable. In many cases, it's 2 to 4 to 8 inches, or maybe a little more than that the farther north you go. about a month ago, there was pretty sizable snowfall totals across the Great Lakes region that was sitting on the ground, but we've had a couple of thaw cycles out there that have kind of taken a lot of that off the ground, and so in many parts of the Midwest now we have bare ground, and the same is true in much of the high plains as well. Really, the big snowfall amounts are off in the western part of the region in Colorado and Wyoming and up in the Rockies, obviously, that's pretty typical for those guys at this time of year. So we got some pretty sizable snowpacks out west, but the rest of the region is not necessarily snow clear, but it's greatly reduced from what it was a month ago. So that was the snowfall totals. If you look at the water equivalent, the amounts are fairly modest in the upper Midwest there. If you look at the color coding there's a lot of light blues, which indicate it's about 2 to 4 to 6 inches of water content in that snow that's still sitting on the ground in parts of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So that's still sitting up there and has the potential of melting off and increasing stream flows. And we'll talk about the outlook for spring flooding here in a few minutes, but then we've got some pretty sizable snow water equivalents farther west in the western part of the region there, and they're up in the 16 to 20 to 30 inch range. So pretty sizable water content sitting up there just waiting to melt off and run down the Missouri River basin. And this kind of zooming in on some of the regions out west there where we have snow-tell sites. So here's some maps on the snow water equivalent as a percent of normal. So the upper left panel, we've got the stations in Montana. Probably more of interest to us right now is what's happening in Wyoming and Colorado, since most of that does go into our basins in our part of the region. But all of those are showing much above average snow water equivalent for this time of year. So there's still quite a bit of snow up there to melt at this point, and at some point it's going to come down the rivers there. So we've got a lot of areas that are in Montana that are in the order of 120 to 150, 160% of normal. Same is true in Wyoming, and maybe a little bit less so in the Colorado region. If you look at the Missouri River Basin, the snowpack, the water equivalent or water content above Fort Peck in Montana there, the left-hand panel there, that solid blue part of the graph there, that's what we've got this year in terms of the water equivalent. And the red line is the long-term average. So we're above average at this stage, and we're actually above what we saw in 2011, which is another year where we had a lot of snow. So not necessarily record-breaking, but it is up there above average and pretty impressive for this time of year. And the funny thing is it's just kind of skyrocketed in the last month or so. Before that, we were actually pretty close to normal on the water equivalent in that part of the basin. It's just shot up in the more recent times. Then if you look from Fort Peck down to over to Garrison in North Dakota there, it's kind of a similar story where this year that solid blue part of the graph there is above normal again and pretty much at or slightly above what we saw in 2011. So there's some consternation out in the west there. I've been talking to Dennis Toddy out at South Dakota, and I think that part of the region is concerned about the snowpack and how it's going to melt out and everything, and that's why they're having that additional call in early April. We look at 7-day average stream flow across the region. The areas in greens are pretty close to normal. If they're blues, they're much above normal, and if in the reds and oranges, they're below normal. So it kind of matches up the experience we've had in terms of rain, precipitation, and snowfall. In the eastern part of the region, we've got a lot of streams that are normal to even above average on the stream flows. You go further west, that problem area of Missouri and Kansas, you see a lot of low stream flows for this time of year. And then you go farther west yet, and then you see above average stream flows coming back into the picture as you go up the Missouri River Basin. So kind of an interesting combination of very wet in the upper Mississippi, very dry in parts of the central part of the central region, and then turning wet again as you go farther east. So I think that probably right now the problem areas are going to be that far west in terms of stream flows and for above average stream flows in the south central part for dry or low stream flows. Well, another thing that's happened this winter is we've gotten a tremendous amount of not only cold and snowy weather, but the Great Lakes have also done a pretty good job of icing over this winter. This is an earlier shot from this year of ice cover over the Great Lakes. And at one point we're up to about 92% ice coverage, and it keeps breaking off and melting and rearranging itself over time. So it's kind of a dynamic process, but pretty dramatic to see those lakes frozen over. We haven't seen that too much in recent years. In fact, if you look at Great Lakes, the maximum ice cover year to year from the 70s when they started to do this by satellite, you can see in the graph there the late 1970s we got up to some pretty impressive amounts. In fact, the record is 94.7% coverage in 1979. Then since then it's actually been a little lower and close to the long-term average for about 2 decades there. Then we've had some stretches where it's actually been much below average for some periods of time there. It was we kind of went from slightly above to much below over the last 10 or 20 years, and really the last 3 or 4 years have been exceptionally low ice cover. And that's bad news for the Great Lakes because when you got open ice cover, you lose a lot of water to the atmosphere. You get that cold, dry air moving in over the top of it, and it really sucks the moisture out of it. So this year we're back up. I think we're about 92% was the max there. So pretty impressive numbers on the Great Lakes ice cover. And as far as the lake levels, that's kind of certainly helped them. Both the snowfall, the exceptional snowfall they've had in the Great Lakes region, and the kind of reduction in the evaporation out of the lakes means that the lake levels have come up. Lake Superior is actually close to the long-term average in the upper left-hand panel there. It's close to the long-term average, much better than it was this time last year on the red line. Lake Michigan and Huron is pretty close to, it's certainly better than last year. Not quite up to normal yet, but it's certainly a big improvement. Lake Erie is down a little bit from where it has been. But all those lakes have kind of shown some recovery from where we've been the last couple of years. Switching gears to the growing season here, this is a product from the Midwestern Regional Climate Center looking at frost dates and looking at the last date when you see 32 degrees across the Midwest, and there's just a median or the 50th percentile. So you can see that in kind of the Midwest part of the central region there that there's a lot of the various shades of brown, which indicate that we're still a few weeks away from an average date of the last fall frost or last spring frost. And then you get in the upper Midwest and further west there, the colors turn green, which means it's later on into May. And I only bring this up in that because we've been tending to be so cold so far this winter and now into early spring, and we'll talk about the forecast here in a minute, I think that is going to be one of the things we'll be watching for this year is the spring frost threat as we move forward. I think it's probably going to be a late one, and we'll see how that has an impact on things. So anyway, this is part of a product that the Midwestern Regional Climate Center has put together, not only looking at what the climatology is, but what's happened this year and where the problem areas might be. So it's something to check out there. It's their Vegetation Impact Program is the name of the overall project. If you look at soil moisture anomalies, these are modeled soil moisture. We've got a large part of the western portion of the central region, I should say, is above average on soil moisture at this point. And then we have this long stretch from Texas up to Minnesota and Wisconsin indication of being on the dry side by the order of about 50 to 100 millimeters. That's the units they're using here. Now, I will have a disclaimer that this is a modeled soil moisture, so it's kind of hard to get a handle on what soil moisture is really like out there right now, because we've had a lot of snow sitting on top of frozen ground, and then the snow melts, and we're not sure how much is actually soaked in and made a difference there. So it's a little unsure about how that has actually played out at this point. This is soil temperatures across the U.S. here, and the areas shaded in blues are in the mid to low 30s at this point. So, pretty much the Corn Belt and pretty much most of the central region at this point is at 32 degrees or less on the 4-inch soil temperature. So not much going on there in terms of any kind of growth activity. This is the U.S. Drought Monitor. This is the latest one that just came out today, showing just major problems with drought out west, California in particular, but also parts of Oklahoma and Texas are having problems. And it's actually getting worse. It's in the last couple of weeks in parts of Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, and Iowa. So we're kind of seeing some conditions deteriorating in that part of the world. And it looks pretty good in the eastern part of the central region there. Kind of zooming in on the Midwest part here. And so right now we don't have too much in the way of drought. In fact, if anything, there's a little bit in Missouri and Iowa is probably the problem areas at this point, but it's still not very far along or very well developed at this stage. And then, like I said, the eastern part of the Corn Belt there is looking in great shape. If you look at the high plains, there's a little more of a problem out there. In fact, you get about 4% of the region is in extreme to exceptional drought at this point, and all that's in that western part of Kansas and that southwest corner of Nebraska and then parts of Colorado there. So kind of starting an area to watch as we move forward, that the developing drought conditions out there, or continuation in some cases. So if we look at the outlooks, we'll look at a couple of those here as we come down the stretch here. This is the 7-day precipitation forecast, quantitative precipitation forecast. Not a whole lot of wet weather across the central region. There's just some light shades of green, so just a couple of tenths of an inch for most areas. There's a system moving through the northern part of the region right now that's bringing in some precipitation, and there's some more forecast out in the Rocky Mountains there. But it's a relatively quiet period here for us, at least compared to the East Coast at this time. So not a lot of precipitation expected in the next 7 days. If we look at the 8 to 14-day forecast, and this gets us all the way into early April at this point. On the left panel there, we've got temperature. So we've got pretty much the whole of the central region and the east in an increased chance of below average temperatures. That's pretty much been the story for the last 4 months on these maps. But they also have a large part of the United States and an increased chance of above average precipitation on that right-hand panel in the green there. So cool and wet conditions seem to be the prevailing view at this point through early April. So that might help us a little bit in those areas that are on the dry side, but it's not going to get us into the farm fields anytime soon. One thing that came out last week, there was a big press release about El Nino coming back into the conversation, and this is a forecast, kind of a composite forecast of the kind of conditions we would expect, and the green bar is the neutral conditions, and that's what we're in now. So very high probability for the next several months now of that remaining the case. But the red bar there, that's the one to watch. That's the El Nino probability, and that actually starts to climb every 3 months there. So by the time you get into about the July, August, September time frame, it starts to bypass the neutral probability. So all the forecasts are kind of leaning towards that happening. It's about a 50-50 shot at that July, August, September time frame. Gets a little bit higher for the rest of the year, but it's not an overwhelming probability. It just kind of hovers around the 50-50 shot. So we'll see how that plays out. But there's a couple of things to keep in mind. One is that it is only about a 50-50 shot, and it's pretty much in the second half of 2014. So its impact on the growing season is probably going to be pretty limited at this point in time. There's just because it's coming on late and it's kind of an iffy proposition anyway. I would say in general the impacts of El Nino are perhaps good news for the central region. We tend to have it to be a little bit on the mild side on temperatures during past El Nino events, although it's not an overwhelming pattern or signal at this point. So we'll see how that plays out. I'm just not putting too much interest in this at this point, just because of the timing and intensity, and I don't think it's going to be a big player for the upcoming growing season. If you look at April temperatures and precipitation, these just came out today. No surprise, probably. April across the central region, the increased chance of below average temperatures for the period, and equal chances on the precipitation side. So that persistent pattern of cooler temperatures is going to be with us for April. This is their April, May, June forecast. So pretty much across the upper Midwest, they got the increased chance of below average temperatures from Montana all the way up to across the Great Lakes. At least the central part of, or the kind of the southern part of central region, maybe get a little bit of a better break of just equal chances. So maybe we'll escape some of that colder temperatures. Looking at some of the other models off the line there's looks like most of the cold weather is expected to persist in April and then maybe start to moderate as we get into May and June. If you look at July, August, September, for the temperature side, they've got a lot of areas of increased temperature probabilities in the south and in the west and the east, but we're kind of in this funny area that's pretty much in equal chances at this point. So nothing to really push our temperatures one way or the other at this point in time, and equal chances on the precipitation too. So summertime, it's pretty much a coin toss at this point. If you look at the drought outlook for the next 3 months, they show that there's large parts of the drought out west and to the southwest is going to persist and intensify. Actually, a little more optimistic about some of the drought conditions we're seeing in the central region with parts of Missouri and Kansas and Iowa and those areas. They're expecting to show recovery at this point. That's kind of that olive green color there across those regions. So a little more optimistic, and I would say in general I'm optimistic because a lot of times as we move in through spring, as we get a couple of systems move through, we can catch up on soil moisture and stream flows pretty quickly. So I'm not too concerned at this point just yet, except for Kansas and parts of the southwest there. This is the latest flood outlook that just came out today for the whole U.S. And as far as the central region goes, there's minor risk of spring flooding if you go to the far west there on the Missouri. And then there's some parts of the Missouri, especially in the South Dakota, that have a moderate risk. And then portions of the Mississippi and Illinois and rivers and some of the rivers in Missouri also have a moderate risk of flooding at this point and some minor risk of flooding farther east. So, it just kind of reflects what we were seeing in the stream flows and then what's left of the snowpack at this point in time that depending on how it plays out, we could see at least flooding in some of those areas. So kind of to summarize, I think the prevailing conditions the last 30 days overall I would describe it as being cold and dry across the central region until you get to the far west there. The drought conditions are slowly worsening in parts of Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri, and Iowa at this point. The good news is the eastern half of the Corn Belt's in good shape in terms of drought. Cold temperatures, cold soils are probably going to be the story. And from the agricultural side this spring, everything is just going to move slowly forward at this point. And as we just saw, there's moderate risk of flooding on parts of the Missouri, upper Mississippi, and Illinois rivers. The outlook, we've got ENSO neutral conditions right now, and we've been in that for the last several months, and that's expected to go through spring and early summer. 50-50 shot of the El Nino late summer and then into fall. But really, the odds really don't go up even in the later part of 2014. Next 2 weeks, cooler and wetter, and then beyond that, spring, expect to be an increased chance of colder than average, and especially more likely in that upper portion of the central region. So here's some information, further information, and here's some of the websites that we use to put together these forecasts, and then you can use to help monitor conditions as we move forward. So we've got a lot of historical data. We've got the climate portal and the drought portal and the National Drought Mitigation Center and the regional centers and the state climatologists. So there's a number of sources here that you can use to track conditions until the next webinar. This will all be up on the website. And then for today, I think that's the end of the formal presentation, and we've got a panel of experts for your questions. So I'll turn it back over to you, John.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. And go ahead, if you want to just speak up. Your phone should be open, and in case you did mute it, it'll be #6 to unmute or *6 to remute. Go ahead.
Are we on for questions?
Yes, we're on for questions. Go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon, gentlemen, and everyone, I should say. This is Bryce Anderson from DTN in Omaha. Interesting discussion today, and I do have several questions I'd like to run by you. First of all, regarding the April and the springtime precipitation outlook. The question I have has to do with the fact that with those below normal temperatures that you were showing, and then the above normal in the central region, and then the above normal temperatures in the south, that seems to imply there might be a frontal boundary in the Delta and the Ohio Valley and parts of the central region. Any comments on why the precipitation chances for April were placed at equal chances in the central region instead of perhaps going along with the idea that the 8 to 14 day is showing with the above normal in this area?
Bryce, this is John Eyes at the Weather Service. Actually, there was some thinking about putting something in, and I believe it was at the last day or so they thought better of it. So I would imagine that we do still have to keep an eye on it, because they're looking at things at a much larger, multi-county level is really what they're looking at. But you're right. If we get a frontal boundary that just stagnates and starts moving storms along it, we could get some pretty heavy rainfall with that. So we'll just keep an eye on it over the next couple of weeks.
Okay. Also, on the flood situation, I noticed that relative to 3 years ago, that the snow cover in the plains area, like in central Montana and northern Wyoming and so forth, is much less than 3 years ago. Does that maybe offer more of a little more optimism that we're not going to have that real heavy snow melt over such a large area of the upper Missouri Basin as we saw 3 years ago?
Kevin or
Yeah,
Kevin?
this is Kevin Lau with the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Loud and clear.
Okay. Good. That's a good question, and I think you hit the nail on the head. We are looking at quite a different plains snowpack than we did in 2011, and so that is the primary reason why we think we're going to have less runoff from snow than we did in 2011. Even though the mountain snowpack looks similar, the plains are different.
This is Brian Fuchs with the National Drought Mitigation Center. Back in May of 2011, there was also some record-setting rains up in Montana right at the headwaters of the Missouri. So
right.
the heavy rains in May coupled with the snowpack that was similar seemed to have been the catalyst for the big push of water that came down the basin at that time. And so I think there's a couple things we need to continue to look at, and that's how long the snow season is going to continue. I remember in spring of 11, the snow season went into May, and then on top of that, we got some heavy rains in the middle to the latter part of May up there. So still going to have to watch it.
Yeah, that leads
yeah,
to...
thank you, Mark. And also we have substantially greater frozen ground conditions than we did in 2011 too.
Yes.
So that's sort of the wild card for this season, at least as far as I see it, is the frozen ground condition. Whatever spring rains we get early enough while the ground is still frozen, it's going to come off.
I have one more question having to do with the El Nino situation. First of all, kind of a two-part thing. First of all, regarding the flooding, the IRI graph that you showed had less than a 10% chance of La Nina. Does that maybe make you more confident in terms of flooding? Because 3 years ago we were still dealing with a very strong La Nina. And then with the El Nino chances for this year, we've seen the Southern Oscillation Index take a notably negative or El Nino direction track in the last week or so. Does that lead to any, ideas about El Nino maybe developing a little bit faster than the El Nino watch last week talked about?
That's always a possibility. This is John. But I think the biggest problems we have right now, there are some other types of issues in the far western Pacific that are controlling the downstream weather right now. And as Jim mentioned earlier, that the biggest problem right now is even if we were starting to see some El Nino starting to come in the next month or two, there's always a lag on the effects of that. So when would that lag actually affect the central United States? And so sometimes those lags can be fairly long. And of course, then there's other modes, as we call them, of the atmosphere that are at work. So yeah, we could see some patterns with El Nino, but the problem we've had in general is we haven't had some really good information that we can base on the summertime, particularly with El Nino, what's going to happen there. We're still keeping an eye on it, and as we kind of figured, some of the probabilities for El Nino aren't as strong early in the summer as they may be later in the year. But that's partly due to the way some of the long-range models are working too. They tend to go a little on the higher side for El Nino than some of the what we call statistical type models.
Time for another question?
Okay, thank you.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Okay, this is Nancy from Nebraska Omaha World Herald. Hey, so going back to the idea of water up in the upper Missouri Basin, do you have any ability to compare the amount of snowpack on the plains this year compared to 2011? And I forgot what your map showed on soil moisture, whether they've got a high moisture level or not. I can't remember. Up in that area.
Yeah, Jim, if you want to go back to that. I believe.
Oh, yeah. Back to the soil moisture, yeah, it was above average in that area. See, oh, there you go. So yes, widespread above average soil moisture at this point.
So in terms of flood potential, you know how much less plain snow there is up in that area? And then the other question I was wondering on the same issue is, when would you anticipate that they'd be frost-free up there? How much longer do you think they have to kind of wait that situation out? And finally, I think implicit in what you were saying was that a frozen ground makes it easier to flood with less rain or less snowpack than a unfrozen ground. So they wouldn't need as much rain this year as they had 2011 to get some type of bad flood. That's kind of what I was asking, those several things. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Jim. I don't offhand have the stats for what the snowpack was like in 2011 as far as the spatial extent. Let's see, if you look at soil temperatures, we showed this earlier about them being pretty much widespread across the region at or below 32 there, and we don't have a lot of data like some parts of the upper Midwest there, but yeah, it's going to take a while to warm, though, get that thought out. When I was talking to Dennis Stoddard earlier, there's some of the, this is just at the 4-inch, so if you go deeper, it can have frost down there too. And he was talking about from personal experience right now that in South Dakota he was seeing that the surface was starting to thaw out, but you still had frozen ground underneath it. So it gets a little complicated that, you might actually be thawed out at 4 inches, but it may be frozen at 8 inches and 12 inches and 16 inches. And so you might get a little more absorption from these rain and snow events, but it's not going to be much. It's going to be kind of limited until you get that whole soil profile melted out or unfrozen.
Also, I was just looking at some of the maps back in that time, and really there was a lot of the high plains, and in that area, the lower elevations didn't have a whole lot of snow on the ground, but we had some later snow that occurred that put quite a bit of snow in April, and I'm trying to remember how far into May that went, but we did have some later snows that I think helped contribute to the runoff that year, because a lot of that came off really fast.
Yeah. And who is this, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. This is John Ives with the National Weather Service in Kansas City.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This is Gina Loss in Great Falls. Can I kind of jump in here a little bit?
Sure. What are you seeing?
There is a big difference in what's going on this year on the plains than what went on in 2011. In 2011, coming into our spring season, we had areas, particularly up along the Milk River, where our snow water equivalents were ranging anywhere from 8 to, I think it was something like 14 or 16 inches in some locations, and some isolated areas in eastern Montana as well. That melted off pretty quickly, caused a lot of flooding up along the Milk River. One of the kickers, and I think Brian mentioned this, was a tremendous amount of rain that fell over south central Montana mid to late May. Over a couple-week period, about 10 days maybe, we had some areas that had half to almost their full annual amount of precipitation in just that 10-day window. And that was all occurring on top of the snowmelt that had just occurred. As this was going on, it was still colder in the upper elevations, so that snow was still accumulating, and that snow accumulation in the mountains actually continued into early June. Typically, our snowmelt starts in April, so our snowpack season was extended at least 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks, and so as that started coming out, you were already dealing with full streams from the plains snowmelt and then the rain event, and now you've got your mountain runoff. So the conditions with 2011, it's not as simple as just comparing the snowpack from what we have this year. to what it was doing in 2011. And right now, many of our basins are higher than they were in 2011. There were just other factors that play into it. And as we go into the spring, there are factors that we can't call, as far as, are we going to have one of those record rainfall events, or are we going to go into a window of time where we have some really warm daytime temperatures, even warm overnight temperatures. Those can cause some significant runoff. There's a certain amount that the soil can absorb in a day, and those warm overnight temperatures kind of help us surpass that limit, and that ends up being runoff. So it's not just as simple as comparing what we have now with what we had in 2011. There are many other factors that went into play.
Thank you, Gina.
You bet.
Well, thank you very much. Any other questions or information you would like to share with the group?
Hi, this is Bryce Anderson again. Could I run my La Nina question by you all again, please, regarding the flood situation? Because 3 years ago in 2011, we were still, if my memory serves me correct, in a pretty strong La Nina, and I think that had a fair amount to do with some of that tremendous, cold and late season rain and snow that we've been talking about in the northwestern plains. Any comments on that, please?
Yes, with a La Nina, we can see some of those areas being cooler and wetter than normal. But the question becomes is how that goes through only February, though. After that, it's a real toss-up after that. It was very, very unusual, no doubt about it. Having that heavy rainfall is what really triggered the whole cascade of flooding. And the latest research that just came out on the attribution to that event pretty much said that it was not within the realm of science for us to predict that.
You might also look at the reservoirs in that time, much higher than they are today.
Yes, that is an issue too. That's true. To a point, I would have. Kevin Stam, are you still on?
Can you hear me?
Yes, sure can. I'm trying to remember what the storage was at that point, though, given the same time.
I'm sorry. Normal.
Yeah, 2011 versus this year. What the reservoir levels?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, to start the spring of 2011, we were at normal levels. This year we have been much lower. I believe right now we're just a little less than 4 million acre-feet below our base of our annual flood control zone. Yeah, so we are a lot lower this year. Due to the drought, which took place in 2012. And I guess I was trying to interject there. And John, you had mentioned the attribution study, which came out, and that is available and does a pretty decent job of explaining the events that led to the 2011 flood.
Matter of fact, I believe if we can actually get a copy to anyone who would like that. And I think Doug Cluck may have sent it out to everyone already, too. It said, explaining climate extremes and assessment of the 2011 Missouri River Basin flood. If not, just go ahead and you can just send me an email or Doug, and we'll be happy to get that to you. Either there's just a 2-page fact sheet, or the full report if you'd like. And they did a really nice job. I thought they did a really nice job on how they put everything together and what actually occurred. And yeah, talk about a phasing of high snow water and in very unusual rainfall and late snows, and put it all together, and it was definitely a recipe for problems. But it just came so late. I think that was before anything much could be done. So, yeah, just let me know. I'll be glad to get a copy out to anyone. Okay, anything else? I appreciate all the questions and comments and sharing of information. Sure appreciate that. And I wish you all the best, and we will have the recording also out probably in the next couple days at the most. Thank you, everybody, and have yourself a good day.